I'm Lai Leong with the Center for Presidential History at SMU, and I'm interviewing Dr. Bronson Percival, former Counter-terrorism Coordinator of the East Asian Bureau. Dr. Percival, today is October 2nd, 2015. Dr. Percival, let's start with your background. How did you come to take on the role of Counterterrorism Coordinator?
My background was that I actually never finished my doctorate at Chicago, so Bronson Percival would be better. But I came in the Foreign Service, and my first job in the Foreign Service was actually the staff aide to a very small counterterrorism office we had with a secretary. And then I went off to the Middle East and had various assignments. And the relevant part of this is that went off to Malaysia in 1983 to be the deputy in the political section. I was in my early to mid 30s. And we started to have the beginnings of what was called the Islamic awakening or Islamic revival. And nobody knew much about it, but I had some background, partially because I'd served in the Middle East, partially because academic background. And my ambassador was very good to me. His name was Tom Shoesmith. This was in Malaysia, and he gave me a chance to go off and meander around neighboring countries for a while. And we did some work on the Islamic revival. And that work was, I don't know what the proper terminology is, but it was blessed by a man named George Tanham at RAND. Then I came back and I was the Indonesia desk officer, and then I turned around to go out to become the consul general, our consul general in Medan, which is Sumatra. So I was very much involved and in the meantime I'd helped with Philippine base negotiations, which is stuff like this. I was very much involved in Southeast Asia. My daughter got desperately ill, and we were not going to get a medical clearance to go back to anywhere in Asia. It was just out of the question. So I revamped my career a bit. Went to the National War College, did some personnel work, went to Europe, and then decided I really wanted to sort of fade out of this a bit and went up and became a professor at the Naval War College, where I started a decade after I'd left it, becoming interested in Southeast Asia again. Put together a little class. I got very sick myself, but I was looking for a job to come back to Washington. And I was recruited to be the head of the Southeast Asia office in INR, Bureau of Intelligence and Research. It was not, it would have probably been considered a little bit of a junior or not exactly a step up, but in this particular case, I was very glad to have it. I knew I was only going to do it for a year and then I was going to retire. It turns out that I'd gone back up on 9/11/2001 to Boston to go to Brigham and Women's Hospital to have something else checked out concerning cancer. And all of a sudden the streets were empty and there were F-14s flying over, and I turned around afterwards and went back to Washington, and there was a great deal of interest in Islam and Islamic radicalism and terrorism in Southeast Asia. So we completely revamped that office.
You're still talking about the INR now?
Talking about the INR office, to focus on terrorism, counterterrorism, the Islamic revival.
Now, when you say we, who were the people who
Well,
decided
by
this?
we, I'm saying the State Department, but there was panic, something very close to panic, and not just the State Department, but the White House and the agency and everybody else were looking for anything they could grab to try to understand what had happened and how important it was, and was it likely to happen again. We did not, when we started the process, when we started really looking at this stuff, we knew that there were some radical Islamic groups in Southeast Asia, and we had lots of bits and pieces, but we didn't have a comprehensive view, and we were under tremendous pressure to come up with that comprehensive view of what was going on.
Before you elaborate on that, I wonder if we could just take a step back. Up to that point, what was your office focused on?
Well, I hadn't been there, except I think for a few weeks before this happened. But traditionally, it would have focused on whatever the intelligence and research component would have been of whatever U.S. policy would have been focused on in Southeast Asia. Essentially, U.S. policy through the 1990s in Southeast Asia had, in my view, tended to drift. There was no threat to the fundamental U.S. interest, which are control of the sea lanes and equal commercial access. And therefore, the focus had been, such as it was, on internal political developments, whatever they may have been. There was interest in very considerable interest in the democratic revolution in Indonesia. There was quite a bit of interest in Vietnam, I think. But all of that, to be perfectly honest with you, just disappeared essentially in refocusing the U.S. government on counterterrorism. So that job ended, and I left the Foreign Service. And then I was recruited to come back and work in EAP. They came up with something that paid the equivalent of a GS-15 salary. And to try to pull together without any real, it was never clear where I fit in the hierarchy, if I fit in the hierarchy at all. But to try to pull together what kind of programs or policies we should have to deal with terrorism in Southeast Asia. And there was also considerable interest in the maritime aspect of this.
So this is now 2002, or
this
is it still
is
2001?
Late 2002. I think I left INR. I retired in September of 2002. I may have gone back to state in something like October or November in this job. And then I certainly left it in early 2004 to go off and write. I went to something called CNA, with Center for Naval Analysis, because they had, well, they didn't have it yet. They had the beginnings of what might have turned out to be money for a book. And then I brought it home, a book from Smith Richardson, which was not on terrorism. It was actually on China and Southeast Asia. Okay. So I shifted focus.
Okay. So I just want to talk us through this chronologically. So when you left INR in 2002, late 2002, what had been accomplished already within INR as far as knowledge about counterterrorism, or rather the terrorists or Islam in Southeast Asia?
I think a great deal had been accomplished. There was a huge focus. It wasn't just INR, it was also all parts of the U.S. government.
So if we may then start then with back to what you were saying earlier about September 2001.
Right.
So you said that there was a sense of panic. So sort of walk us through it. What actually happened? How did the institutions then develop, or the knowledge then develop?
Well, I'm looking at it from the perspective of a division head in an intelligence and research branch. So I've got really two different ways I'm looking at it. One would be the other parts of what would be called the intelligence community, okay? And the second part of it is the Secretary of State, EAP, and to some extent the White House. There are also, I don't know quite what term to use, but there are a whole series of people who are very well connected, either politically or bureaucratically, who've been charged to find out and to deal with certain aspects of counterterrorism. Whether it's somebody who wound up working for Dick Cheney, I can't remember her name, how do we put this together? Or it's somebody over at the Treasury who says, how can we do the financial aspect of this? Or claims they can do the financial aspect of this. There was a presumption, how do I want to put this? I want to be a little careful about this. I did not realize the resources that the United States could and would bring to bear on figuring this out, figuring out what was happening, who was connected, and why. It was quite extraordinary because there was very little knowledge in the United States or the U.S. government about terrorist organizations or Islamic radicalism and terrorist organizations in Asia for reasons that go back, decades. So there was a kind of part of I use the word panic, but it's the wrong word, perhaps, in a sense. It's more of oh my God, we've really got to understand this as fast as we possibly can. They were starting from a very, very low base of knowledge. And there were, for some time, a number of people who really didn't know what they were talking about. Writing books or pontificating or proposing policies or somehow making a living out of pretending that they did.
Now, people in government?
Some were outside of the government. And there was a great deal of money floating around. If you could convince various parts of the U.S. government that you were an expert on terrorism.
Were they taken seriously?
Some of them were for a while because people didn't know. I don't want to be critical, but the truth of the matter is, outside of the centers who did understand what was happening to a certain degree in the Middle East and Afghanistan, things like that. Once you got beyond that, once you got into India and Southeast Asia, once you got into the Maghreb, and I think, although I'm not sure, but further out, people knew very, very little about it. Okay, the two accomplishments in a year. I think there was a great deal of surprise. I mean, our Australian friends were, after all, Southeast Asia's their world. For many of them, were just how do I want to come up with the right word? They were not in tears, but many of even the experts who had thought of Southeast Asian Muslims as being particularly moderate and reasonable, and so on and so on. They were just, there's a level of almost as if they'd been betrayed. Learning that, there were these very radical groups and that Al-Qaeda had people in Southeast Asia. So I think the two accomplishments in that first year, it's hard to separate that first year you really need to think of it in two phases. There's really 2001 through maybe 2004, 2005, where there was just a tremendous focus on Southeast Asia. And then the perception that basically the problem had been solved and U.S. interest starts to float away. But two things happened. One, I think fairly quickly, the foreign Al-Qaeda linked or Al-Qaeda operatives in Southeast Asia were identified. That happened pretty fast. And second thing was, and this was a painstaking and very difficult job, but we started to put together an idea of how Jemaah Islamiyah worked, which was the regional Islamic group, and started to sort out some of the groups in the southern Philippines, who was more serious, who wasn't, why, how did this work? So I think those were the two accomplishments, and it happened. Identifying the Al-Qaeda people happened even faster than the second part, because the second part was a bigger and much more complicated operation.
Well, I certainly want to come back to that. But before we get there, when did it become apparent that the U.S. needed to look beyond the Middle East to Southeast Asia? Because if you say, you said at the beginning that knowledge about radical Islam was really quite shallow to begin with, and obviously 9/11 was committed by groups in the Middle East, hence Afghanistan, then later Iraq. Why was there even a turn towards Southeast Asia?
There was a turn towards Southeast Asia because we started to find out that Al-Qaeda had all kinds of links in Southeast Asia, because we committed some troops to the southern Philippines to deal with the Abu Sayyaf group as advisors. We just found all these links that were going back and forth. We would find people who had served, who'd fought in Afghanistan, who'd gone back to Southeast Asia.
So that happened pretty quickly then?
Well, certainly by 2002, certainly within, it's hard to, there was a steep learning curve. And it's hard to say when people at the top or near the top started paying attention to this. But I would argue that by early 2002, people were paying attention.
And was it by following the money? What was the...
The money wasn't it. In fact, I always thought the money part of it was exaggerated myself. No, it was following links, people.
Just movement, individuals.
I don't want to go any further. It's links.
Was this mostly through intelligence, U.S. intelligence, foreign intelligence?
It was a combination of everything you could get your hands on, from cooperation with Australia, obviously, to countries in Southeast Asia, many of them. They were on a learning curve themselves, to some very open source stuff, just putting the dots together.
Now, I've heard that for a long time, prior to 9/11, the U.S. depended on Australia really for intelligence of this nature. Is that true?
There's a constant idea that the United States did not pay as much attention in terms of intelligence resources, at least to maritime Southeast Asia, because there was the perception that the Australians had it covered. I don't think, obviously we had resources there too. My own personal judgment is that I think the best way to do it is we worked very, very closely with the Australians. We were constantly talking with each other. And after all, it makes perfectly good sense. Even in academia, it's Australian universities that have a focus on Southeast Asia, particularly maritime Southeast Asia. Now, you shouldn't think of this as entirely intelligence. This is intelligence, it's open sources, it's academia, it's every source you can get your hands on.
When you say open sources, what do you mean?
Newspapers, books, conversations, everything.
How do you wade through all the stuff that's out there?
Well, that's the problem. That was one of the big problems. I remember somebody who was working for me, and I think it may be one of the few times I sort of felt guilty about pushing somebody, because she was probably working 60, 70 hours a week trying to put the dots together of who some of these people were.
So you say the Australians were aghast?
Some of the Australians were, I wouldn't say aghast, amazed might be a better word, that their presumptions or their assumptions about Islam in Southeast Asia had not been entirely correct. This was particularly true after the Bali bombing, which was a cathartic event for Australia.
What about other governments in the region? Were they surprised?
Yes, I think so. Yeah, all of this was a surprise, I think, to everybody. Nobody had a really good feel for what was going on. And why should they? I mean, there was very little reason to do so. So it was a learning curve for everybody.
But Muslim militancy wasn't a new thing for them.
No, it wasn't at all. And it wasn't to a certain degree for others who watched, outsiders who watched that part of the world. But it had been, under Suharto, it had been suppressed. And then you had the Democratic Revolution of 1998, which opened up much more space in Indonesia. It had tended to be in Malaysia, little sort of explosions of tiny little kelompok, little groups. And the police thought they had a pretty good handle on that. What nobody really understood was that this regional organization was evolving, that there'd been much more space opened up following the Democratic Revolution, and that the things had changed rather quickly. People had come back from Afghanistan, and you were dealing with a different situation. So, and many of them didn't want to believe it, particularly in Indonesia. I mean, until you had the Bali bombing, the initial Indonesian reaction was simply denial.
How did the Bali bombing change things, if at all, or accelerate?
Well, it was horrendous loss of life. How would I say? It was great shock to Indonesia, which had thought of itself as a evolving democracy with moderate Muslims. It was a great shock to Australia. It was, at the time, thought of as the second biggest thing after 9/11. It was just it was an explosion. It forced an awareness that hadn't been there before.
So as this picture began to emerge, so I'm thinking now still of that first year,
Yeah.
between September 2001 and September 2002. What did the U.S. government decide to actually do then as this picture came together?
Well, I would argue that the U.S. government was very sensible. I would argue that the reasons the U.S. government was very sensible may be different from what some of the more senior apologists for the government might say. But essentially, there were all kinds of proposals out there not out there, that's the wrong term. There were various ideas floating around in parts of the U.S. government, which never became U.S. policy, to take military actions which would have been immensely counterproductive. And in fact, there were proposals to reorganize the way we did our business in Southeast Asia that would have been immensely counterproductive. These proposals were turned down. One of the people who played a role in turning these proposals down was, all of a sudden I can't remember his name. The man who had been vilified as the deputy in DOD for the cheerleader for the invasion of Iraq.
Paul Wolfowitz?
Paul Wolfowitz. Wolfowitz had been the ambassador to Indonesia, and he, at least we were told, we don't know, I do not personally know if this is true, but he was widely believed to have stepped in and said that military action isn't the answer. We need to work with these countries to find ways to do it.
Do you know where the proposals came from?
Oh, there were proposals floating all over the U.S. government. So the emphasis became very much on working with and improving the ability of the governments there to identify, find, arrest, do whatever needed to be done, these terrorist groups. And in fact, that worked very well. The only U.S. military force was the force in the southern Philippines. They were just advisors. I think at the maximum, there were only 600 people. There was instead money and effort and time was poured into training and liaison and that kind of thing, and it worked. There was some frustration initially with Indonesia, but after the Bali bombing, Indonesia started to get its act together. And in fact, you could argue that their approach, where they take suspects to trial, reaffirm the legitimacy of the process, of their process itself. So,
just because I'm interested in what could have been or what might have been, some of these proposals that were rejected, would they have involved actual U.S. troops on the ground?
I'm not going to go into that.
So the plans, the cooperation with the governments in the region.
Yeah.
Let's talk about each country specifically, perhaps. So in the case of Indonesia, obviously, that's where the JI was based.
Yeah.
What type of cooperation, what type of advice and support was given to the government there?
Well, I can't remember exactly all the bits and pieces or when they came to pass, because it was not only the Americans, it was a number of others, particularly the Australians. But there was training for the police. There was ways to use, you had to tap into various pots of money.
Where was the money coming from?
Well, this was a problem. You didn't have sort of central funds to use. So you had to get bits and pieces here. You get some from Paycom, you get something from Inkley, you get something from this.
Was that hard to do?
Yes, it was hard to pull it all together. But remember, there was a great deal of pressure to do this. So there are ways to do it. But it was pretty much across the board. It was, train prosecutors, come up with small boats for the Marine Police, help the police set up eventually what was Detachment 88, which was their special counter-terrorism operation. Liaison, passing various kinds of information back and forth. I can't remember, to be honest with you, what bits and pieces came at what particular time. But the situation changed markedly after the Bali bombing. Megawati had been, who had been the Prime Minister of Indonesia, President of Indonesia, had been very reluctant to get involved until the Bali bombing. And then when SBY took over in 2004, cooperation increased even more. So it was, I don't want to say everything you can find that made any sense, but there was a certain element of that. I would argue, I don't know the figures again, but the entire amount of money we might have thrown at Southeast Asia was probably less than $250 million, which is tiny compared to Afghanistan or Iraq or whatever it may have been. A year. I'd have to go back and dig to find the various bits and pieces.
Did the breaking off of military ties and not providing the Indonesian military with training in some of the years preceding this, did that get in the way?
I think there was concern that it was going to get in the way, but in fact it didn't, because the police were separated from the military, and we focused on the police.
You worked with the police rather than the military. Were there concerns with human rights?
Well, there were always concerns with human rights.
But I mean, just in terms of, the new enhanced cooperation or partnership with the Indonesians.
Not on this, because the focus of the human rights focus was, yes, there was. Obviously, there's always concern. But more specific concern would have been with the TNI and what the parts of the Indonesian military had done in East Timor.
How did, what was your sense of how the Indonesians sort of figured out, look, this really is a problem that we have?
I don't really understand the question. Try again.
Let me rephrase that. When did they, obviously the Bali bombing was a big wake-up call, but I suppose prior to that, did you begin to see that they were awakening to this, or was it very hard for them to come to grips with it?
I think it was very hard for them to come to grips with it. Remember, I mean, you have this huge explosion of the ability to say, democratic freedoms and freedom of expression. And you have this huge explosion of various elements of Islam, which get expression. We're talking about a sliver of a sliver of a sliver of a sliver, so that it was very difficult for the Indonesians to realize that there were, in really crude terms, bad guys there. They were more willing. I think it's fair to say that they were more willing to recognize that there might be some bad guys who weren't Indonesians, who happened to be in Indonesia, than that they had a problem within their own society.
Now you mentioned this, sliver of a sliver of a sliver. Obviously, we're talking about a very small, radical community or group.
Well, you have lots of radical communities. I mean, you can have people who are Salafi radicals, you can have Al-Arqam, you can have tons of them. Are they radicals who are willing to use violence, who are connected with international terrorist organizations? That's what you're looking for. So.
And were we quick to recognize those distinctions? The U.S., that is.
Yeah, we were pretty good. Yes, we were.
What about...
Not entirely, but yes, we were.
So quick as in within months, within a year or so?
Yeah, we started to figure some of this out.
Okay. What about other countries then? Our partnership with Malaysia, say. What form did that take?
The Malaysians were pretty confident of their ability. We worked with them. We set up a Counter-terrorism Center with them, and they appointed some non-entity to head it. It was really just a way to sort of buy us off. But they worked. There was good liaison. But they were pretty darn sure that they're pretty confident of themselves. They weren't, it wasn't, how do I want to put it? If my memory serves properly, there wasn't the worry that there was about Malaysia being able to control this. How do I want to put this? A lot of what was happening in Malaysia was actually being used as a place for R&R and planning and meetings and that kind of thing.
So when you say they were pretty confident, you're talking about the Malaysians. The Malaysians were confident about this? So they didn't share the same...
They were pretty confident about their ability to track what was going on in their country.
And were they justified in that confidence?
Pretty much.
So the U.S. agreed with Malaysia that it was mostly that type of activity? It wasn't anything that was immediately concerning?
Well, there were obviously differences of opinion, but...
Did the U.S. push the Malaysians? Try to get them to do more, maybe?
I don't know if push is the right term. I think it's more along the lines of more questions of strategy and tactics than anything else.
What would the U.S. have preferred that they do differently?
Well, there was some pressure in the United States for various people to be picked up, and the Malaysians, for example, would much rather have kept watch on them than that kind.
What about Singapore?
Can we go back to some of this other? Okay, yeah, Singapore. The Singaporeans were shocked when they uncovered a plot in Singapore, and Singaporeans were always working very, very closely with everybody they could. They were deeply shocked that there was something in Singapore, but that was it.
Mm-hmm. Was there close intelligence sharing between Singapore and the U.S.?
Singapore is a very close friend of ours.
Mm-hmm. So there was?
What do you think?
What about the Philippines?
I don't really remember that much about the Philippines, to be honest with you. It was a different situation in the sense that you had these various groups in the southern Philippines who had been fighting their insurgencies, or whatever you want to call it, for a long period of time. Then you had the Abu Sayyaf group, which went back and forth and was a combination of just plain old thugs with some Islamic connection at first among some of the leaders. So it was different. We had to keep carefully distinguish between we wanted to very carefully distinguish between those who might have connections to Al-Qaeda or JI, and those who were those who were part of the more MILF, Abu Sayyaf group, who were involved fundamentally in an insurgency against the Philippine government.
Was it difficult to distinguish them?
Well, there were inevitably something of a tendency to try to throw everybody into the same category.
Tendency on the U.S. part or on the Philippines part?
Various parts in both governments, but it really wasn't a big problem.
Did you ever get a sense that because these resources were now becoming available to combat terrorism, that the governments in this region, in some ways, maybe took advantage of that? I'm thinking in particular of the Philippines, to try to put down their own insurgency using this as cover.
Sure, of course. Particularly, I think it's fair to say that there was renewed attention to Malaysia, the Philippines, Singapore, and that was particularly welcomed by those countries. Renewed American attention to those countries. They saw the benefit of having, in other ways besides counterterrorism cooperation, of having a even closer relationship with the United States. Whereas Indonesia was kind of ambivalent, and the other countries realized that they weren't getting much attention, or the pattern of the United States not paying much attention to most of Southeast Asia was continuing. In Vietnam, Thailand, Burma, whatever it may be.
So they actually welcomed this attention? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, they could certainly use it, sure.
Even though it was,
Well, they did.
focused on counterterrorism.
All of them complained that the United States was exclusively focused on counterterrorism. And Southeast Asians all felt that they deserved more attention for a whole variety of other reasons. But for some of these countries, particularly, and I would say the Philippines, Malaysia, and Singapore, they were less, how would I put it? They were, they didn't welcome the American obsession with counterterrorism, but they welcomed the general interest in their countries, the growth and the increase in the American interest in their countries.
Were they able to build on that? I mean, did that actually translate into other benefits for them, or not?
Yes, I think it did.
In what ways?
Well, I just think the relationship was strengthened across the board. I mean, I can't remember exactly, but I think it was 2003, but we negotiated a new agreement with Singapore. We were working very closely with Singapore. There was renewed attention to the Philippines, which had basically fallen off the mental map of large parts of the U.S. government, including the U.S. military, which was still how would I put it? Still recalled the fact that we'd had to give up our bases at Subic at Clark Air Force Base. We long had a very close, if quiet, military relationship with Malaysia, but we'd also had a lot of political difficulties under Mahathir. I can't remember when Mahathir stepped down, but he did somewhere around that point. And his successor, we had a better relationship with. So I think there was this perception that, in a whole host of ways, that the bilateral relationships became better.
Did the U.S. work with them bilaterally mostly, or was there a use of multilateral platforms?
Well, you have to go back a little bit on this. If you go, okay. I was not involved in Southeast Asia in the 1990s. But from what I know of the history, American interest in Southeast Asia after the solution of the Cambodia problem in the early 1990s and Vietnam's withdrawal, American interest in Southeast Asia was fading. I can't remember what somebody called it, but America just wasn't interested, essentially. And what that meant was that it was very hard to coordinate a policy across the board in Southeast Asia because the most senior people who were interested were really only at the Deputy Assistant Secretary level in DOD or state. And that's just not high enough without some support higher up in the system. So what tended to happen was that a lot of things tended to get sorted out at embassies. an ambassador could, in effect, appeal above his nominal Washington boss, if he had to. So you had a tendency for relations to become even more bilateral. The Bush administration came into office and showed no particular interest in Southeast Asia that I know of at all. The focus, as I understand it, I want to be a little careful here, the focus, as I understand it, was really on the major powers, and in this case it meant China and Japan. And particularly we were going to be a little tougher with China, was the whole campaign rhetoric, the whole. The Bush administration also came in with an antagonism to multilateral organizations. So you had people who were in political appointees of some influence, who basically, said, ASEAN is a talk shop. We don't want anything to do with this. We don't want to bother with any of this stuff. Or if they want to do it, it's up to them. We don't have to join all these organizations. And then the Clinton administration, the last part of the Clinton administration, involvement really it had to do with democracy and human rights. It had to do with what's going to happen in Indonesia with a revolution and some really silly talk about Indonesia falling apart and that kind of thing. Mostly we're supportive of the democratic revolution. It had to do with Clinton went to Vietnam. That was a new opening to a certain degree. It had to do with Gore making his comment in Malaysia that drove Mahathir up the wall about Anwar Ibrahim. There really wasn't, if there was any theme, it was a human rights theme. And that wasn't much of a theme because it was also bilateral. So that I would say that when the Bush administration came in, Southeast Asia was perhaps would have naturally, if it was possible, even fallen further in interest, because there was very little interest in multilateral organizations, and there wasn't that much interest in human rights, certainly not as much as there had been under the Clinton administration. And there was no perception yet of China as a current threat. There was worry about China in the future. There was, there was some concern about the aftershocks of the Asian financial crisis. So there was an economic interest. We have real commercial interest in Southeast Asia. But there really wasn't a discernible unifying theme to what the Bush administration was going to do in Southeast Asia. Or whether it was going to pay more attention or not. Unlike, for example, the Obama administration, when it came in 2008, they saw Southeast Asia as just this incredibly juicy, low-hanging fruit that they could pick. And they did. So, it was sort of waiting there. It was very bilateral. It was not multilateral at all. That's the best way to put it, yeah.
So if I understand you right, there was no sense at that time of the potential role or threat that China might play in Southeast Asia?
No, there was the very beginnings of, let's talk about the great powers, because the Bush administration was very interested in the great powers. And the key to this was, what are we going to do with China, as I understand it? But China in 2000 or 2001, 2002 was still a relatively poor, not very influential country in Southeast Asia that had a horrible historical record of interfering in these countries' domestic affairs, and was viewed with a great deal of distrust. China set out to overcome that, but they just started the process. They'd hyped their assistance during the Asian financial crisis, which was not that great, actually. They had put forward the proposal for an ASEAN-China free trade area, but I don't believe it had actually gone forward very far. Chinese investment was minuscule. The beginnings of Southeast Asian investment in China, particularly Thailand and Malaysian investment, Singapore a little bit too. But it was just beginning. So there was this sort of, oh yeah, we ought to keep our eye on China. Japan was just fading. The Koizumi, I think, went after a trip by Wen or whoever the senior Chinese leaders were, and he really had nothing to offer in Southeast Asia. And despite the fact that Japan was still a huge investor and trading partner and so on and so forth, they were already getting beat up by China is too strong a term, but much too strong a way to put it. But they were already they were fading, and there was an anticipation of their fading even more, which did not help. But it would be wrong to say that the United States was deeply concerned about China and Southeast Asia. It was not. Yes, it's something to keep our eye on. Yeah, we might have a problem here down the road. Yes, we understand that Southeast Asians don't want to have to pick between China and the United States. They never want to have to pick between any external powers. But it's very different from the situation even 10 years later.
Did you get a sense that of how the China reacted, or if it had a reaction at all, to increased U.S. interest in Southeast Asia?
Yeah, it was quite interesting. Whether there was a debate amongst the cognoscenti and this kind of thing, about why China did this, but the Chinese were very restrained. They could have blasted the Americans, for sending troops to the Philippines or whatever it was. Chinese were very, very careful. In fact, it was the time where the Chinese anti-American attempt to push anti-Americanism with Southeast Asia declined even further, declined very fast. Now, you can make arguments about why that happened. One argument is the Chinese just wanted to get along better with the Americans. They didn't know how the Bush administration was going to react to them. Okay, let's be careful and get along with the Americans. The other element in this is that it started dawning on the Chinese that criticizing the Americans made Southeast Asians uncomfortable. So what do I get out of this? I don't get anything out of this. So I might as well tone it down. So certainly anti-Americanism was not a theme, at least in our perceptions in Southeast Asia, was not a theme in a prominent theme in Chinese policy, or it was not as prominent as it had been. Put it that way.
Did the Uyghurs play a part, you think? You know, sort of a quid pro quo that, hey, if you leave us alone with the Uyghurs, we'll leave you alone.
I don't remember hearing a thing about Uyghurs. It's only China specialists who worry about Uyghurs. Sorry, but anyway, that's a nasty comment. And it's not fair, and I know it's not true. But no, I mean, Uyghurs are just not an issue, or were not an issue.
For the U.S., you mean?
Yeah, in Southeast Asia that I know of. I mean, we were very concerned about Cambodia returning Uyghurs to China. Thailand just returned Uyghurs to China. Within the last few months, I think. But I don't remember it being an issue back then.
What about Japan? Was there a reaction from Japan to U.S. interest in Southeast Asia?
The Japanese didn't know how to react. I think it's the honest truth. They were very self-absorbed. Their focus on Southeast Asia was very much economic. Had been for decades. They would make the right noises verbally, but they didn't do anything. They had nothing to offer, essentially. They or very little to offer. I mean, they didn't have the counterterrorism expertise or the resources to do anything in that sense. They had tried to get involved in the late 1990s in encouraging and assisting with anti-piracy. And basically the Southeast Asians had been Malaysia, Indonesia, had been very reluctant to let the Japanese in. The Japanese had sent their Coast Guard, but and they would, Southeast Asians would agree to a bilateral Coast Guard training kind of thing or something like that, but they weren't going to agree to multilateral organizations, multilateral exercises. It took a decade for the Japanese to basically fund this anti-piracy center in Singapore. And I'm not sure Malaysia and Indonesia even now send people. There was I remember going to Tokyo, and there was a meeting where there were a number of Japanese agencies, and we were all going to talk about maritime issues and counterterrorism. Many of them hadn't talked to each other, and many of them really, it's not that they didn't want to be helpful. They didn't know what to do. They didn't know how to make it work. They hadn't organized themselves. Japan said the right things, probably tried to do what it could, but had very little to contribute, I think. Also the Japanese had other issues they were dealing with. They were more focused on China than they were what the United States was doing in that part of the world. I think would be a fair way to put it.
I remember, about 10 years ago or so now, in that period, lots of academic papers at least came out suggesting that the rhetoric of the global war on terror, the so-called Bush Doctrine, really
Annoyed people.
caused tensions. Did you feel that on the ground at your level?
Well, I mean, a lot of people thought the rhetoric was overblown. And certainly Southeast Asian countries were, that's much too strong a term, wide field. There was concern that the rhetoric was so overblown in some countries in Southeast Asia that it would be followed by pressure to do things that they did not want to do. I remember a trip to Vietnam. I can't remember when it was, 2002, 2003, something like that. And we were pushing counterterrorism. I think it was through ASEAN somehow. An ASEAN, I can't remember what it was, in a non-traditional security meeting or something. And we were pushing counterterrorism. And the Vietnamese were very polite, but they clearly thought, what does this have to do with us? And quite frankly, the American ambassador view was, well, what does this have to do with U.S.-Vietnam relations? It doesn't have, counterterrorism is totally irrelevant to this, to our relations. So, how counterproductive sweeping statements might be, it's impossible to tell. But another way to think about it, perhaps, is look at how quickly public opinion in Indonesia changed after the 2004 tsunami and the American assistance in the recovery. It just went strong anti-Americanism, partially because of the whole rhetoric about the global war on terrorism. And then it just flopped completely, not completely, but an extraordinary change when it was seen that the Americans actually were being helpful. So I don't know where else to take that for the moment.
I wonder if you could tell me more about your role as Counter-terrorism Coordinator.
Yeah. It really didn't fit in any hierarchy at all. Essentially what had happened was that I think Matt Daly, but probably a number of other people, had sort of looked around and said, here's this guy, Bronson Percival, who seems to know something about terrorism in Southeast Asia. Let's find some way to get him in here. So they hired me on some contract. I'm not sure how it all worked. But it was good because I could get paid a substantial amount of money and keep my pension. I had a tiny little office in RSP, a regional security policy or something like that. It wasn't clear to me who my boss was, if I had a boss. But I was sort of the guy who was keeping an eye on terrorism stuff to a certain degree, but also Jim Kelly, who was the assistant secretary, was very interested in the whole maritime element of all this. So I did not fit in the bureaucracy. Even the title was sort of a made-up title that came and went away, I'm sure, when I left. I was sort of the, what shall I call it? The consultant who was actually getting paid to keep an eye on not just INR, what was being produced in terms of the intelligence product, but more important, the whole variety of programs and possible programs to find ways to help countries in Southeast Asia improve their ability to carry out various kinds of counterterrorism. A classic example of this would be, there was, I can't remember what it was called, but PACOM had, I'm not sure it was PACOM, maybe it was DOD, but there was sort of leftover monies. It was called the 1206 Fund or something like that. And it was, for the military, it was tiny amounts of money. For the State Department, it was huge amounts of money. But it was money that was fungible, that you could pump into various kinds of counterterrorism training or exercises or whatever it might be. Somehow, I think it was Matt Daly who actually did it, but we got some money to give assistance to the Indonesian Marine Police and give them some boats. So, it was a very odd kind of job. No real authority at all. It was much more along the lines of, oh, this is the guy who knows a lot about this, we ought to talk to him. Or, gee, I know a lot about this, how about this, Matt? Or there was another guy who was the office director in RSP. It was more like that.
So who did you actually, I know you say that you didn't have a superior per se, but who were the people you communicated with the most?
The person I communicated with the most was probably Matt Daly. Sometimes I'd see Kelly, not very often. There was the guy who was the office director for regional security policy. I can't remember his name, to be honest with you. And then there were, of course, a whole slew of other people in other parts of the government. For instance, I was the guy who would go to the financial thing. There was this huge financial tracking operation and the guy who was watching over it, I had known when he'd been in Europe, when I'd been in EUR. He's now our ambassador to Mexico. Oh, shoot, what's his name? I can see him. But anyway, I would go for EAP to this thing. So it was that kind of thing.
Did you work with people from other regions too, or was it just you on Southeast Asia?
It was me on EAP. I mean, the others didn't really have, nobody else had something like this. I would work with SCT, but much of that was personal connections.
SCT again is?
Secretary's Counterterrorism Office. It's not called the Counterterrorism Office. But originally it had been this very small S/CT. There was a guy there named Bill Pope, who I'd worked with in the Netherlands, who had actually been my boss, who had a job there. There was some other people I knew there. I also knew the academics, or think tanky world, that was working on this kind of stuff. In Singapore, in the people who were writing about it from Southeast Asia, the American academics who were starting to write about this stuff, Zakabuza and a whole slew of them starting to write this stuff. So, I mean, I remember going up to Boston and took Zach out to lunch at the Penang or whatever the hell it was, whatever the heck it was, and trying to build these networks in effect. And they weren't just in the U.S. government, because that wasn't going to be enough. I think I remember going to something in London, a conference. I went with Kofor Black to Southeast Asia. He was the head of the counterterrorism operation. That's the best way to think of it. It didn't work, and it didn't fit in any hierarchy. It was much more along the lines of, this guy can work out, has contacts all in the government and outside the government, and he can find things and make and suggest things and come up with ideas that other people can't.
So was your job more of the sort of making proposals, the ideas guy, or were you actually also out there trying to implement stuff?
I wasn't trying to implement stuff at all. Implementation, I mean, I'm not a intelligence guy. I'm not a policeman. I'm not a soldier. No, there was no implementation involved. I remember going off, though, with the guy who was the RSP director. We went off to Hawaii to try to get the Coast Guard involved in some of this stuff, the U.S. Coast Guard, because there was a U.S. Coast Guard operation. I can't remember what it's called, but it's their people who are responsible for Oceania and Hawaii and so on and so forth. So it was, no, I did no implementation. Neither did I get involved in, I had no real idea. There were rumors floating around, but I had no idea if we were picking people up, where we were taking them, what we did with them. No idea at all. I was not involved in any way, manner, fashion whatsoever. It was, how do we pull the intelligence together? How do we find the programs? How do we link into the academic and think tank community? That kind of thing.
So even in Southeast Asia, your contacts were mostly then with the academic community?
No, it was across the board. It would be, I'd go with somebody on a trip occasionally. It would be, we'd go see some government people. But I would also know who it was at RSIS in Singapore that was starting to follow this stuff. Or there was a Filipino journalist who wrote some book on counterterrorism. It really wasn't very good. But, I'd know who they were. Or, I knew who Sidney Jones was. And would talk with Sidney Jones. Not very often, frankly, but, and at the same time, I'd be meeting with some of the officials. But I was never leading. I'm not the assistant secretary for XYZ. I'm more like this is our expert. I remember writing a proposal we got very involved in how we could help improve countries' capabilities to deal with maritime problems, maritime security. Within the U.S. government, we would tend to cast it in terms of counterterrorism because that would bring money. With Southeast Asians, we would cast it in terms of anti-piracy because that was politically acceptable. I remember writing the memo that basically proposed that we get going on this to Armitage. So it's much more like that. It wasn't, I hadn't been formally, I retired from the Foreign Service. I knew I wasn't going to do this very long. I wanted to go out and write a book. For me, it was a way to get into or reestablish contacts with sort of the academic think tank world as well.
Did you get a sense that people like Armitage, for instance, took your ideas seriously?
Well, they certainly did on the maritime stuff. And Jim Kelly was very interested in the maritime stuff. He was a very interesting guy to me. I didn't know him. He didn't know anything about Southeast Asia. He was a Korea guy. But he was bright. He was open. He wanted to know, unlike some others. And he was particularly interested in the maritime stuff. What can we do with it? In fact, he wanted me, I was leaving, and he had said, well, can't we create a job to make you our maritime guy? And I said, no, I don't want to do that. I want to go off and write a book. So that's what it was. Don't think in terms of a hierarchy. It was a particular time, place, combination of in and out of the government, which could only have taken place at that particular time. And how they came up with giving me the money, I don't know. They gave me the money. And it was legit.
Sure.
Because normally there's a cap. If you're a Foreign Service officer, you can't. There's a cap about how much you can make above your pension. So it was fine for me for a year. That was great. A little over a year.
Talk a little bit about the maritime security aspect that Jim Kelly was so interested in.
Well, we have always, if you go back and look at Southeast Asia, there are two fundamentals of American interest in Southeast Asia. One is nobody else messes around in those maritime choke points, straits, lanes of communication. Okay, that it's just so basic. We forget about it because often it hasn't been threatened. Okay? But I now work part-time for something called CNA, which is the Navy's think tank. You know, probably months a year out of everything. But, you know, they know. Bingo, bang, immediate. So there's always been this interest in maritime security. There was horrendous piracy that exploded in the Strait of Malacca after the democratic revolution in Indonesia. The Japanese were very worried about this. This was a big deal in the Japanese press, so on and so forth. We were sort of worried about it. But we were also worried about maritime terrorism. Remember the frigate that was blown up in Yemen? There was something called the Limburg, I think it was. It was a cargo ship that was blown up somewhere in the Indian Ocean, south of Yemen. There had been a couple ferries blown up in the Philippines with huge loss of life. We knew the bad guys were going back and forth on boats. People move around in Southeast Asia on boats. There was all this stuff in the thinky tank academic press about studies about what happens if you blow up a boat next to an LNG plant. And much of it was tremendously exaggerated because, frankly, it's very hard to blow up an LNG plant. But anyway, so there was just this great interest. And PACOM wanted to get involved. I mean, they were really, I remember going to a conference where I gave a talk, 2003, in Hawaii. It was a conference hosted by PACOM. And the head of PACOM was this guy, Admiral Fargo. And I was just blown away. Here's a 4-star admiral, and he knows the names of the top 30 terrorists in Southeast Asia and knows something about them. I was just floored, maybe a Navy captain or something, but, 4-star. They really wanted to get involved. So there was this whole natural flow of interest into how could we help. And it was interesting. It was always, how could we help these countries, in effect, establish maritime security? And unfortunately, there's an AFP correspondent who misquoted Fargo. And it blew up into this huge political mess, where basically he said, the newspaper report said, the Americans are going to come in and patrol the Strait of Malacca. And the Malaysians and the Indonesians, and to a lesser extent the Singaporeans didn't say much, but the Malaysians and Indonesians went, "No, you're not. That's ours. No way." We didn't have a plan to do that. That wasn't what we were going to do. But so we then spent the next 6 months or a year maybe reassuring these countries that that's not what we were going to do. Well, but we will be glad to help you do it. And we did as much as we could. The Japanese were involved too. Lots of people were interested in this. The honest truth is piracy was suppressed, but it was suppressed primarily because the Indonesians went in on land and told the Indonesians who had been doing a little piracy on the side, "It's okay, Ahmad, if you do some smuggling out of Singapore, but no more piracy." That's basically, that's over an exaggeration, obviously, but that's partially what happened. So there was this huge fall in piracy, and there was never a major, as feared there was going to be, a major maritime terrorist incident in the Strait of Malacca. Singapore was worried sick about this. The economic consequences could have been very large. Because those straits get very narrow, but it never happened. Thank God, chalk one up to success.
Was there ever a sense that these terrorist cells were targeting that?
No. Well, I'll put this. There was enough chatter about maritime terrorism generally, not specifically to Southeast Asia, that there was good reason to be worried about Southeast Asia as well.
So targeting
Ships.
piracy as a measure didn't yield so direct results in terms of capturing anybody or limiting the growth of cells or anything like that.
Well, it may have. I don't know.
Right. But nothing that you could draw a straight line to.
But nothing you can draw a straight line to.
Now, it's curious to me. I mean, you mentioned that Admiral Fargo, for instance, has all this knowledge. Why did the U.S. government draw on that type of knowledge, or were there bureaucratic hurdles to that kind of?
No, I think we pretty much did. The information was shared, and it was very hard to come up with this stuff. I mean, you know, people were digging from the very beginning. But I think the picture came together, and there wasn't. If there were arguments, it wasn't so much about what was out there. The arguments were more about what to do about it. And the arguments were pretty sensible. I mean, you can make an argument. One of the reasons the arguments were pretty sensible was that we had already put most of our forces and our money and everything else into Afghanistan and Iraq, and we didn't have much left over for Southeast Asia. I'm sure we could have found the money if we really wanted to, or the people. But we hit on a fairly successful approach, which was to help improve the capability and to encourage the willingness of the countries in Southeast Asia to deal with it. And they did, eventually. So, yeah, I mean, and, you know, go back to the Strait of Malacca. I mean, those countries, the littoral countries, are very sensitive. They basically blowed off Japan when Japan wanted to do anti-piracy stuff. The Indians at various times have come and asked if they could help, and they were told, bye-bye. The Americans, you know, they don't want any major power essentially patrolling. But they're willing to take all kinds of assistance. So to establish maritime domain awareness and to be able to deal with it.
So you did end up working closely then with PACOM?
Yeah, sometimes.
Capacity? What about officials in DOD? Were they open to?
I don't remember working with DOD people very much. Yeah.
Wouldn't it have been natural to work with them? Or?
Yeah, I suppose it would have been, but I don't remember doing it very much. I mean, I remember going over, but with other people. I mean, I was never the guy who was or I don't remember being sort of the guy who was the lead. I'd go over with X, or I would. I can still remember going into the Pentagon. Was it Paul Wolfowitz we were going to see? But I can't remember who I was with. Was it Jim Kelly? It certainly wasn't me. It was just, you know, I was along as the expert.
You mentioned going on a trip with Cofer Black. How closely did you work with him?
Well, on this trip, very closely. There were two of us and one young aide he brought with him. And, you know, we got to talk about what was going on in Southeast Asia, which he didn't know much about. But generally, I wouldn't, you know, work with him unless there was a particular Southeast Asia thing coming up, or that, you know, I'd be working with somebody much lower down in the system, on whatever the issue might be. I mean, there was somebody who it wasn't Shari Villarosa, because she came later, I think. And she'd actually worked for me when I was on the Indonesia desk. A lot of these were personal contacts. I mean, you know, personal links that went back a long time. If you think of this in the organization, if you think of this in a classic bureaucratic organizational structure, it don't work. It just didn't work that way.
When you remind me again, what was the focus of the trip that you took with Cofer Black?
The trip with Cofer Black was basically to get ASEAN to back up to issue a statement, a U.S. ASEAN statement on condemning terrorism and all this kind of stuff. And we went to Hanoi, where we put together, they had their their counterterrorism meeting, ASEAN counterterrorism meeting. We put together a work plan, and he said, "Okay, we got all this work plan. Great, we worked this out. Okay, let's do this, 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 this." And I had to turn to him and said, "This is an ASEAN work plan. They will do what they want to do when they want to." Yeah, we went to Bangkok. We went to Singapore. I remember going to, there was an ARF meeting in Phnom Penh. And I went, I'm not even sure Corporate Black was along on that. It was a whole nother separate thing. Jim Kelly was on it. I played a very minor role, but I was sort of there if they needed to have somebody to talk to about terrorism in Southeast Asia. And I remember we got a quick flight up on a plane to spend about half a day at the Angkor Wat, and then we were on the plane home. A commercial plane, not the secretary's plane or anything like that. We were on a commercial plane home.
So in terms of, in your interactions with Ambassador Black, did you have a sense of where Southeast Asia sort of fit into his larger vision or strategy for counterterrorism?
I think that's a very hard question to answer, because the answer is I don't know. I mean, my impression was that this was a very smart, open guy. He knew what he knew, but he knew he didn't know much about Southeast Asia, so that he was asking lots of questions. But, his concern was sweeping up the remnants of Al-Qaeda in Southeast Asia. I mean, that was his office's primary concern. This trip was really a more diplomatic part to it, to get the ASEAN, build the support for the statement, go to the ASEAN workshop on counterterrorism, talk with some people in Thailand, talk with some people in Singapore.
Do you think he or his office, his center, appreciated the distinctions between Al-Qaeda cells or Al-Qaeda connections and sort of more homegrown?
Yes, they did. People did. Yeah, they started to get it pretty quickly. Now, of course, it gets very complicated, because you can get people who may have been from one terrorist group who are not Southeast Asian but have lived in Southeast Asia for many years, took a Southeast Asian wife, are in the southern Philippines providing training. This is not black and white. There's all kinds of shades of gray.
Did you contribute or know about how watch lists were put together? Because the United States was also putting together watch lists and no-fly lists. Did Southeast Asia have anything to do with that?
I'm sure we provided names the same way we provided names to the financial thing, but I don't know anything more about it.
What about, it has emerged since then that there was a black site in Thailand. Did you ever
I knew
get a
nothing
sense?
about it.
There was no talk about
Zero.
it back then?
If there was one. I don't even know if there was one.
Well, it came out in the Senate report
Oh, okay.
on torture back in, actually, end of last year.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
and the one in Thailand was the very first black site that was established.
I didn't know anything about it.
So were you keeping tabs on people like Hambali and Masalamat? So was that part of your brief?
Mm-hmm. I mean, as much as we could. I mean, we were, I was trying to come up with in INR, we would contribute to whatever the product was. Then when I went over to EAP, I mean, all of us were very interested in where Hambali might be or what happened with Maslamat or anybody else. But we weren't involved in any way, manner, shape, or form in the actual process of tracking these people or finding these people. I mean, that's somebody else.
Which agency was in charge of that?
What do you think?
I can make an educated guess, but you might know.
Well, why don't you make an educated guess?
So when you left in 2004, was it?
Mm-hmm.
How would you say, where the U.S. government was in terms of counterterrorism in Southeast Asia?
I think we're in pretty good shape. Basically, the Al-Qaeda-linked groups had been picked up. Not groups, people. The countries, Southeast Asian countries, were very much very good at tracking people themselves at that point. We had a pretty good idea of how JI operated and who was who. We weren't perfect, but we had a pretty good idea. There were still some bombings, as you well know, but I think indicative of the sense that we'd gotten there, by 2005 or so, the Bush administration just started to lose interest in Southeast Asia real fast.
Because of the success?
Because I would argue because they said, okay, we've solved this problem, now we're going to go on to the next one. And I'll give you a classic example of this, and it was true in academia too. I still remember going to a conference, it was a day-long conference, and I got asked a question about Southeast Asia, and I got up and I said, we've done all this, we've really been successful. Or maybe it wasn't a question, maybe I was on the program, I can't remember anyway. And I think the one question was, what are the implications of this for the situation in Syria? I mean, in other words, it was over. The core interest, the people who really lived and died on this stuff, from Afghanistan and Iraq and Iran and all that stuff, Syria, so on and so on, the Arab world, the Middle Eastern world, they'd taken over again. And Southeast Asia was peripheral, same way I'm sure a bunch of other places were peripheral.
So now that you've left government, looking back, what's your assessment of the Bush presidency's approach to Southeast Asia overall?
I don't think they did how would I put this? I think they missed some opportunities. And I think it really had to do, as much as anything else, with Condi Rice. She disliked going to Southeast Asia. She skipped several of the standard ARF meetings. The drop in interest in Southeast Asia once the Americans came to the conclusion that terrorism was basically under control was precipitous. I just don't think, I think the Bush administration did a good job in what was for 4 years or 5 years, the 4 years, the dominant issue, which was terrorism and counterterrorism. But it did a very poor job with multilateralism, I think. It never had the guts to get the Burma albatross off its neck. In fact, also, you could argue that at certain points, Aung San Suu Kyi basically ran U.S. policy for Southeast Asia to some degree. At least that's what people said. I mean, obviously that's an exaggeration, but and I think that what indicates what the Bush administration missed is what the Obama administration was able to do with incredibly little effort when it came into office. Signing the Treaty of Friendship and Cooperation, which then led to the EAS. There's just a host of things. Rebuilding military-to-military relationships much more rapidly. Obama visits Clinton. Building a reaction to the South China Sea once the Chinese redid this, became interested in the South China Sea again. Constant, rebuilding of the relationship with Vietnam. Revamping our Burma policy eventually. So I think it's not that the Bush administration did damage. That would be too strong, in my view. They did do one thing, I think, very well, but they missed an awful lot of opportunities.
Was it merely lack of interest, or was it because they were just so focused on counterterrorism?
Well, I don't know what the answer to that is. I'm not sure it was just so focused on counterterrorism. I mean, that was part of it, but it was also, they were focused on other parts of the world. I mean, you can only suck up so much of the senior officials and political leaders' time. And if what's driving you is what's going on in the Middle East, that's what's driving you. But I think there was a reversion to this. Also, there was this assumption that you could still see it amongst people who were still there at, let's say, sort of mid-level political appointee levels, where there was still the antagonism to multilateralism. There was still the focus on China. There was a guy who came in after Kelly. God, I can't even remember his name, but EUR guy, what's his name?
Came in after, Chris Hill.
Chris Hill. Well, the joke, I don't know if it was true, I wasn't in the government, but Chris Hill was known as the North Korea desk officer. And he certainly, I don't know if it's true either, but the perception amongst American Southeast Asia watchers was he stuck a whole bunch of EUR people as ambassadors down in Southeast Asia who might be very good people, but they didn't know it, they had no background. Yeah, what else can I say?
You mentioned ambassadors. So when you were in government, did you work with the ambassadors out in Southeast Asia?
Sure.
Who were the ones who were most helpful, and in what way?
Well, the best one was the guy I worked for in Malaysia, a guy named Shoesmith. But I mean, do you mean since at post 9/11?
Oh yeah, sorry, I do mean post 9/11.
Yeah. Who was in Indonesia at that time?
Was it Skip Boyce?
Skip voice, yeah, it could have been Skip. He was pretty good. I don't remember who was in Malaysia. I remember the guy in Vietnam who didn't know anything about terrorism. Very nice guy. I remember the DCM in Manila. No, I don't. I can't help you there. I mean, if I'd done something, I mean, I would have done something on trips. I might have been in contact with them. But if there was anything formal, it would have gone through, Kelly, actually.
When we talk about, again with 2020 hindsight, when we talk about the success in Southeast Asia in counterterrorism, looking back now, after all these years, do you think that it was an unqualified success, or did you maybe miss something?
Well, I think the honest truth is that there's a tendency to pat yourself on the back because there were no disasters. Whether it was an unqualified success, of course, is a whole different question. I mean, and you can't say something like this is an unqualified success. I mean, you had a number of terrorist incidents. You had Bali 2, you had the explosion in front of the Australian embassy, you had a whole bunch of other stuff. You have people who've come out of, who've been sent to jail and have come back out again. I do not know if there's any link between these people and those who are going off to fight for ISIS. I just don't know. Obviously, this kind of thing is not an unqualified success. But you had many of these people had family ties going all the way back to Darul Islam in the late 1940s. So I think it was pretty well done. Why it was pretty well done? Maybe because a combination of various bits and pieces came together and we didn't have unlimited resources, but it worked out pretty well. That's about the best I can tell you for that.
I think it's just occurred to me as you speak. I have come across articles that mention that that regional governments in Southeast Asia were much more interested in the soft approach to counterterrorism, meaning rehabilitation and so on, whereas the U.S. is more interested in a sort of muscular approach.
Yeah.
Is that sort of description accurate at all?
It's as with so many of these generalizations, it's kind of misleading. There were people in the U.S. government who were very frustrated, for example, by the Indonesian insistence on trying people in courts that were compromised. But there were also people in the U.S. government who said the Indonesians have to go this way because this legitimizes the process of conducting counterterrorism. I mean, it's not. Otherwise, it would be perceived that, at least among some, that these people were just picked up because they were radical Muslims. So there was debate. But to say that, the Southeast Asians wanted, as a general rule, to adopt a harder line, and the Americans wanted to a softer line, and the Americans wanted a harder line. It doesn't work that well. It really doesn't. Yeah.
A name that's come up a lot in my other interviews is Karen Brooks,
Yeah,
who was very close to Megawati. Did
Yeah.
you have any interactions with her?
a little bit, not much.
Did she have any contribution to counterterrorism efforts?
Not that I can remember. I think she kind of moved on, hadn't she?
She did, but I think she was still in office when you were.
I don't know. I don't think so, because maybe she was. But then she moved on, and Jean Christie took her place. Jean Christie took her place before, while I was teaching up at the Navy War College. So, because Jean came up and talked. So she would have moved, I'm sure she would have moved on. Unless she came back.
I thought she was at the NSC during the first Bush administration.
Well, maybe she was for a while.
But you don't recall.
I don't recall working with her, really. No, I don't. I mean, I knew who she was. We had lunch a couple times. I don't remember much else.
Did I miss anything major? I mean, was there something that I should have asked and did not ask?
That's always a good question. I don't think so. The only thing I'd say is that you need to think of sort of a whole bunch of different bits and pieces coming at the counterterrorism stuff and sort of agglomerating to a something that some kind of a magnet or something instead of a hierarchy. Instead of this agency and that and hierarchies. The other thing I would say is I want to emphasize that it's not that the Bush administration did a bad job. I don't think they did a bad job. I just think, the non-counterterrorism, I just think that they missed a lot of opportunities.
Okay. Thank you.